Don't know what I did to do that.
You're only on 2 now, Larry.
Yeah.
I,
I don't know how that happened.
yeah, I see you on 2 also.
Yeah.
Zoom is a mystery, indeed.
I shared my link
sometimes.
with Judy, but she changed her name. Did you share your link with someone?
I emailed it to Rusty.
Oh,
Maybe that's Rusty.
That
I
could
doubt
be.
it.
All right. Oh, wait a second. I did that wrong. Hold on. Yeah, I did that. Oh, so what I did was instead of downloading the Teshuva, I made screenshots of all the pages of the Teshuva, and then I just ordered them on. Here we go. Okay. So I'm not going to be able to see all of you at once. So I just kindly ask that when, if and when you have questions, please just, ask away, or comments, please just ask away, or feel free to type something into the box, whatever you like. So I wanted to include this for a couple different reasons. First of all, we've been going over some teshuvot, and some of them are, they've been around for a little while, and not that isn't valuable, but I thought just to mix things up a little bit, that I would include a teshuva that was
Very interesting.
yeah, that, question that was put in something for just a year ago. And also, just real quick, I mean, these are now usually there are 25 people. Not every rabbi is able to make every single vote, but these are the names of the people who are a part of the committee. They've evolved over the years. There's been thankfully more diversity. There certainly are a lot more women on the committee than there used to be. I don't know if it's quite half and half, but I think it's close. And that's a good thing. And I know there are, I count at least 3 people who were in rabbinical school with me at one point or another, meaning that age-wise, there is more diversity. I mean, there are at least a couple of my professors on this as well. So they are of, probably of the older group in this, but you also have some people who were my contemporaries. So that's certainly a good thing. And what's notable is the author of this teshuva, Rabbi Micah Peltz. He is 3 years younger than me. He was in USY with my sister. And we worked on the same age group at a Camp Ramah years ago. So, so I've certainly known Micah for a long time, and he's very, very talented. He's a senior rabbi at a large synagogue in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. So, and obviously, the other part of this is, these are vaccination and ethical questions posed by COVID-19 vaccines. It was, now this was approved at a time when the vaccines were just rolling out. So some of the questions and concerns that are going to be in here are questions and concerns that we have kind of seen played out over the last year plus. And I just thought that it would be kind of a neat way to look at a teshuva that is really responding to a very modern problem. I mean, or a very modern problem issue, just something that's on our minds, understandably, and something that has, for better or for worse, been a matter of controversy. Maybe we think that this shouldn't be a matter of controversy, but regardless, it is. And it was important to have something about this. So, like I said, I can't at the moment. I cannot see all of your heads at the same time. So just shout out, call out, questions, comments, whatever you want to do. So the question is: now that vaccines for COVID-19 are available, is there an obligation to be vaccinated? Can Jewish institutions require vaccination for employees, students, and congregants? And what should be the guidelines for their distribution? One thing that I think we're going to be touching upon at some point here is the matter of, now it's like, you can fall out of bed and have access to vaccines if you want it. I mean, places are practically giving them away at this point, partially because there's this desire to get as many people vaccinated as possible, and also it's just it's just considered, now they've been far more mass produced. But if you remember the early months of 2021, it was kind of a novelty at first that people were gotten vaccinated. I remember when I was able to secure an appointment in my first shot was at the end of February. I remember just feeling how fortunate I was to be able to get it. Fortunate in the sense that, I was obviously looking forward to being vaccinated and, have a defense against this awful disease. But also I felt fortunate. I mean, and thankfully, my ability to get the vaccine had to do with, the fact that not only was I in a position to educate children, but also do officiated funerals. Those things, mattered to that group, and so, thankfully, I was able to obtain it legitimately. I don't feel like I had to skip in line. But there were questions about people who were maybe utilizing certain influence, their influence or perhaps financial prowess in order to secure one. So those are things that are going to come up. Anything before we start into Rabbi Peltz's answer? Okay. All right. So it starts with, the Torah commands us to be careful and watch yourselves, which is understood by the Talmud to mean we should avoid danger wherever possible. Elsewhere in Deuteronomy, we find the mitzvah of placing a parapet or a guardrail around one's roof. This is understood to mean we should actively take steps to protect ourselves and others. As Rabbi Moses Israelis, now by the way, you may have noticed some names come up, numerous papers, right? Moses Israelis is the one who wrote the Ashkenazic response to the Joseph Caro's Shulchan Aruch. Joseph Caro was Sephardic, and Moshe Israelis was Ashkenazic. He was in Krakow, Poland, and so he's considered to be one of the great halachic masters. Anyway, Moses Israelis clearly articulates that one should avoid all things that endanger oneself, as we treat physical dangers more stringently than ritual prohibitions. The Torah emphasizes that we need to take responsibility for the well-being of those around us when it says, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. This is understood to mean that we do everything we can to safeguard the health of others. This is a short summary of the many sources that make it clear that taking preventative measures during this time of pandemic, like wearing masks, washing hands, and maintaining physical distancing, are not just recommended, but are obligating by halakha, Jewish law. If there is even a chance that our behavior can protect our lives and the lives of others, then that would take precedence over any other consideration. Okay, up to this point, Rabbi Peltz is saying things that I would say that even a rudimentarily, I don't know, somebody who is only barely educated in Judaism, but knows the understanding of pikuach nefesh saving a life. None of this is surprising, right? I mean, it seems like it's a fairly straightforward thing, right? You do whatever you can to save a life, and that takes precedence over just about anything. Okay. When it comes to vaccines, he writes, we can say much the same thing. In 2005, the CJLS overwhelmingly approved a teshuva by Rabbi Joseph Prauser entitled Compulsory Immunization in Jewish Day Schools. Question posed was whether Jewish day schools could grant an exemption of religious grounds for a child whose parents refused to permit vaccinations. By the way, we've already been going into this question of people who say that they have a religious exemption. These are, you have some Jews who perhaps make that presumption, but people of other religions as well. Rabbi Prauser, he goes on, after a thorough examination of the sources and contemporary medical research, concluded failure to immunize children against vaccine-preventable disease is a serious compound violation of Jewish law. There is no basis in halacha to support a parent's request for a religious exemption from state-mandated immunizations. Though the issue for Rabbi Prauser is vaccinating children, it is clear from the sources that he presents that a vaccination would be a mitzvah for adults as well. Indeed, this is a conclusion that Rabbi Elliot Dorff comes to in his book. With its strong sense of community and duty, the Jewish tradition would have us use communal measures to preserve our lives and health as much as possible. It would be a violation of Jewish law, for example, for a Jew to refuse to be inoculated against a disease, at least where the inoculation has a proven track record of effectiveness. Jews, on the contrary, have a positive duty to have themselves and their children inoculated against all diseases where that preventative measure is effective and available. Just to note quickly here about the timing of Rabbi Prauser's teshuva, 2005. I don't know this for sure, and if any of you has better information than I do, then please feel free to offer it. It seems to me that 2005 was like around the time when the general sort of anti-vax movement was kind of taking hold in America. Does that sound right? I feel like it was around that time that I remember started hearing about it. I mean, the stuff I remembered hearing, I mean, the stuff, where the place where I remembered hearing about it first, and this is not to say that this was the beginning, was this this goofy celebrity, Jenny McCarthy, who claimed that, I had my kid I got my kid vaccinated, and now my kid has autism, and the vaccinations caused it. That was my understanding of where the conversation began. I feel like it was around that time. So this is another case where, Rabbi Prauser writing this in 2005, I think it was sort of spurred by sort of the beginning of this anti-vaccination movement, a movement that has become obviously so much more prominent in the last year. So just a sense of where we get this. Rabbi Peltz continues, this is the position taken by many halakhic authorities today. It would seem then that there is an obligation to be vaccinated against COVID-19. We must note, however, that Rabbi Dorff's guidance of being inoculated against a disease is obligatory when the inoculation has a proven track record of effectiveness. The safety and effectiveness of a vaccine are primary concerns. So it does leave that opening, right? It leaves that opening to the possibility that, well, if you don't feel safe with if you don't feel that the vaccination is safe, then okay, maybe you don't have that obligation, right? With that said, of course, such suspicion needs to be legitimate, not just based on crank science. This is me talking now, not Rabbi Peltz, but and so now we're going to go into why Rabbi Peltz says specifically with COVID-19 that this is how it has to be understood. While immunizations approved by government health authorities might always bear a statistically recognizable risk, it is generally very small. and therefore the benefit of vaccination to the health of the individual and to society takes precedence. However, that risk is determined by research studies and experience, which are regulated by government agencies. Because of the pandemic, COVID-19 vaccines have been approved in the United States by the Food and Drug Administration under emergency use authorization. Okay, so keep in mind, again, this is written, this was voted on January 1st, 2021. All right, so again, these are still in the early days of the vaccine being public. The US is not alone in its fast track approval process. Countries around the world have had to use an expedited approval process for COVID-19 vaccines in order to combat the pandemic. EUAs are used very rarely in the US, though they have already been invoked to approve various therapeutic treatments for COVID-19, such as convalescent plasma. To be granted an EUA, the known and potential benefits of a drug must outweigh the known potential risks. Additionally, the FDA has said that for a vaccine to be approved under an EUA, it must show at least a 50% reduction in coronavirus infection and have a strong record through at least a median of 2 months of follow-up time. So this is helpful, at least, in the sense of in terms of understanding, on what basis did the FDA first acknowledge, first come out with the pronouncement, okay, we can have this vaccine used for the general public, but at that point, it was kind of pending official approval, which eventually it was granted. How do we weigh the potential risk of a fast-track vaccine against its potential benefits for the individual and society? Two sources are helpful in addressing this question. Both were written in response to Edward Jenner's invention of a safer smallpox vaccine at the turn of the 19th century. As David Ruderman has shown, at the time, there was debate among Jewish authorities about the risk of introducing a small amount of smallpox into a healthy person, right? Because that's what was in this vaccine. Rabbi Israel Lipschutz was an enthusiastic supporter of Jenner's vaccine. In the Boaz section of his Tiferet Yisrael commentary to Mishnah Yoma, he wrote that the infinitesimal risk, which he described as 1 in 1,000, is appropriate against the much greater risk of contracting the illness. From here, we can say we must weigh the real risk of contracting COVID-19 with the presumed risks of a vaccine approved under an emergency process. The second source is Abraham ben Solomon of Hamburg, also known as Abraham Nanzig, who published a letter in London in 1785. Nanzig himself was mourning the death of his 2 sons to smallpox, and his letter was a passionate argument for inoculation against it. Rabbi Prauser ably summarizes Nanzig's arguments, but there is one point that is particularly important for our discussion here. Smallpox was a leading cause of death in Europe in the 18th century. An estimated 400,000 people died annually. This led Nanzig to an important conclusion. For Nanzig, smallpox is so widespread and so contagious that everyone should be considered at risk. And therefore, the benefit of the vaccine, even one that is new and without a long track record, as Jenner's vaccine was at the time, outweighs that risk. In other words, the greater societal benefit of taking the vaccine, along with the serious consequences of contracting the disease, outweighs the risk it might pose to a few individuals. Nanzig's evaluation of smallpox in late 18th century Europe can be compared to our experience with COVID-19. Given the exponential infection and mortality rates, the impact it has had on our behavior and on society, and the necessary precautions individuals, governments, businesses, and schools have taken, it seems fair to say that we, too, are all at risk from this disease. This places a responsibility on each of us to take preventative measures, such as wearing masks, limiting gatherings, frequent hand washing. This responsibility would also extend to being inoculated against the coronavirus. It's important to note that these obligations are not mutually exclusive. Some of the potential vaccines are effective against developing severe disease, but it is unclear if they prevent transmission. Because of this, preventative measures will need to remain in effect for some time into the future. Might I add, at this point, Boy, don't we know that. So now I'm going to do a little commentary here. I happen to notice a commentary by someone named Barry Weiss. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. Barry Weiss used to write for the New York Times. She's a sort of political, societal commentator. She has written books about combating anti-Semitism. So she talks about things that affect the Jewish community, and also things that affect the world, the rest of the world as well. And so she goes on, Bill Maher's talk show, and they were talking about, moving on, after 2 years of COVID-19. And her comment was, I'm done with COVID. She's like, I did everything that they told me to do. I wiped down the groceries. I binged watched Netflix. I did all the things. And now, and then she said, and we were told that if you get the vaccine, we can go on with our lives. And then we keep on hearing, no, we can't, no, we can't, no, we can't. Now, this is my opinion here. A very poignant response, a number of poignant responses to Weiss's anger came in the form of a number of first responders and frontline workers who responded and said, yeah, I'm done with COVID too. But I just got off a 12-hour shift in the hospital with patients on ventilators. Yeah, I'd like to be done with COVID too. Sorry to inconvenience you, and sorry to limit your plans. In other words, just because you're tired of it doesn't mean that we just have to throw away all precaution. Now, are there certain risks that we can take that perhaps we couldn't take a year ago? There probably are. But I think the point of what Rabbi Peltz is saying is that, he was raising the possibility, even as the vaccine was beginning its rollout, just because you get vaccinated doesn't mean that, you snap a finger, everything goes back to normal. And I will add, editor's note, especially if not everybody's taking the vaccine. Right. So it is I find it kind of prescient that Rabbi Peltz put in here, the vaccine might not be the end of this, taking the vaccine might not be the end of the story. Because I think that's something that a lot of people are struggling with. You told me to get vaccinated. You told me to get boosted. I did that. Well, those emotions are, I sympathize with the emotions. That doesn't mean we can just now do whatever we want. Okay. Soapbox done for the moment. Again, feel free to throw in your own opinions and what have you. But I do think it was sort of notable that he threw that in. From an halachic perspective, the question is whether each of the COVID-19 vaccines, even though they were approved under emergency processes, would be considered a refuah b'duka, an established treatment. In approved medication. From the vantage point of halacha, an established treatment must be known to be generally effective. Rabbi David Golinkin shows that the testing of the COVID vaccines, though not as rigorous as usual, still meets the requirement of refuah b'duka, and therefore we would be required to vaccinate. Additionally, the Orthodox Union and the Rabbinical Council of America have also ruled that there is a requirement to be vaccinated for COVID-19. By the way, I will quibble with that last sentence. I don't think that as a conservative rabbinic body that the opinions of Orthodox organizations are relevant. It's great that they agree. It's great. And, certainly, and those, Orthodox Union and RCA, they have both been, very much at the forefront of saying, yes, get vaccinated. Don't mess around. But I don't think it was, I think this was just sort of he didn't need to add that sentence, but yeah, and it's okay. It's important to note that all these obligations to vaccinate also require the individual to do so in consultation with their personal healthcare provider. Given all this, it is clear that all those whose doctor recommends vaccination are obligated by halacha to be vaccinated against COVID-19. Okay, so that's part of what he has to say. Now, the question of requiring vaccination for employees, students, and congregants. As noted above, Rabbi Prauser's 2005 Teshuvah thoroughly addressed this question for students of Jewish day schools. He concludes, unless a specific immunization is medically contraindicated and so documented by a reliable physician, unvaccinated children, even those who, in violation of Jewish law, have secured a religious or philosophical exemption from the state, are properly denied admission to Jewish day schools. Halachic sources and reasoning behind this teshuvah resonate with our current situation and the requirement to vaccinate against COVID-19. All right, so I don't think I need to do the rest of that paragraph, but in other words, it's like, all right, we already have our precedent in the conservative movement. Okay. Now, regarding vaccine distribution, the ethical questions that guide the fair distribution of the COVID-19 vaccines are complicated. They can be asked on at least three different levels: global, national, and personal. What obligations, if any, do rich countries have to poor countries in sharing the vaccine? This has certainly been a topic of conversation over the last year. Within a country, how do we decide who gets the vaccine first? And as individuals, do we have an obligation to wait our turn, or are there circumstances where one could jump the line? These are complex questions that many committees on ethics and governments are in the process of working through. Here we'll present Jewish sources that give us insight. It is important to note, however, that the principle of dina de malchuta dina, the law of the land is the law, applies to vaccine distribution. In other words, we are obligated by the decisions made by our government on these matters. Okay? It's important to note for a moment what dina de malchuta dina. You may be familiar with this concept, but I just want to mention it real quick. What it means is that if you are living, if a Jewish law directly contradicts a civic law, it is still our priority to be law-abiding citizens. Okay, so if there were a law, for instance, I'm obviously making this up. Like if Judaism still allowed ritual sacrifice and then of animals, and then if there were laws in the United States that contradicted that said you cannot treat animals this way, then sorry, we can't sacrifice the animals. That's what dina de malchuta dina essentially means. This can be a major issue. You may have read that there are countries that have reportedly have reportedly considered banning circumcision under the principle of dina demakuta dina. If you lived in that country, I forget which country it is, somewhere, maybe Scandinavia somewhere. If you lived in that country and you had a son and wanted to circumcise your son, that would not be legal. It would not be legal to do so in that country. That would be a very a very difficult dilemma to be Jewish in that country. I don't think it's come to that at this point, but it's something that people are watching, because again, according to this principle, you wouldn't be able to do that. So anyway, so with all of this, right, we have to consider that if the United States makes certain laws in terms of who gets to have vaccines first or what have you, that has to hold sway. In March 2020, the CJLS approved 2 tissue votes, one by Rabbi Dorf, one by Rabbi Danny Nevins, on triage during a pandemic. All right, so this was, so by the way, I mean, March 2020, the fact that there were 2 tissue vote already written about the pandemic meant that this was fast tracked, very much so. I think these tissue vote happen a lot faster these days. I think part of it is because I think now you can vote. I mean, I assume that that law committee meetings are happening over Zoom at these days. These tissue vote were dealing with allocating life-saving treatments such as ventilators during a pandemic. In their writings, Rabbi Dorf and Nevins lay out criteria for making this determination that are helpful in thinking about our issue. Though Rabbi Nevins refers primarily to the allocation of scarce medical resources to already infected patients, his discussion of pre-infection triage of PPE and vaccines is helpful for our question. Of the 3 questions to consider when considering treating person A or person B based on different sources, these 2 are germane to our topic. 1, who is in most immediate and grave danger? And 2, is one victim terminally ill? Jewish law differentiates between brief survival and long-term recovery, with a year of survival as the criteria. Okay, these are, this is tough stuff here. Determining who is in most immediate and grave danger is an important consideration. It substantiates the initial phase of vaccination, which prioritizes healthcare personnel who are working with COVID-19 patients and residents of long-term care facilities who tend to be more vulnerable to the spread and severe consequences of the virus. The second point has raised more difficult questions, as some studies have shown that the elderly may not benefit as much from vaccination if their immune systems are already compromised. This, though, is unproven and controversial, and might I add that, again, this was written more than a year ago. We know a lot more about that matter than before. In his Teshuvah, Rabbi Dorf revisits the 5 frameworks for determining how to allocate a community's limited resources that he developed in his book, Matters of Life and Death. He identifies 4 moral principles to guide triage decisions. 1, which is treating people equally, first come, first served, or through a lottery. 2, favoring the worst off on the basis of the rule of rescue. 3, maximizing total benefits in utilitarianism, measured either by the number of lives saved or the number of life years saved. And 4, promoting and rewarding social usefulness based either on instrumental value for the future of the society or on reciprocity for past contributions, including those on the front lines of fighting COVID-19. It's Rabbi Dorf has, having met Rabbi Dorf a number of times, he is very much acquainted not only with Jewish philosophy, but of general matters of moral philosophy. These principles based in Jewish sources are helpful in thinking about the ethical distribution of the vaccines. While ideally everyone in the world would get equal access to the vaccine immediately, this is not possible given the vaccine's initial scarcity and logistical challenges. Still, the final three principles are helpful guidelines in thinking about global and national distribution. Favoring the worst off would lead us to prioritize those most vulnerable, such as the elderly, the immunocompromised, and or minority groups who have historically been discriminated against in healthcare. Right? I feel like in the initial months of the handling of the vaccines, I feel like at least some of this was taken into account. Maximizing total benefits compels us to protect the public's health, which also includes socioeconomic well-being in the short and long term. I don't think that the United States necessarily made that a consideration. Promoting social usefulness makes us consider how we can best vaccinate those who help others for the benefit of all. When it comes to global distribution, the rise of vaccine nationalism has made implementing these principles even more complicated. Vaccine nationalism occurs when countries seek to inoculate their citizens before everyone else. While protecting its citizens is a top priority for all countries, and this concern has accelerated efforts in the development of the COVID-19 vaccines, it also leads to a greater inequality of distribution. According to the Duke Global Health Innovation Center, which tracks vaccine procurement worldwide, there will not be enough vaccines to cover the world's population until 2023 or 2024. I don't know, by the way, whether that, whether there's been an update to that. I don't know whether that's the case. Because I feel
since we're in 2022, it may very well be accurate because there's still large areas of the world that have insufficient vaccines.
Fair enough. Yeah, I guess I just don't know. I don't know whether there has been more production, whether production has accelerated. But no, fair point. We have, the idea of wealthy countries stockpiling vaccines to help level the global playing field. Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, the World Health Organization, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations have promoted COVAX, a worldwide platform to support the research, development, and manufacturing of COVID-19 vaccines. All right, so what Rabbi Peltz is saying here is that, yeah, it should be a priority. It should be a priority to make sure that vaccines go to places where they might not ordinarily have access. I don't think it's necessarily happened that way. Only somewhat less complicated is the ethical distribution of COVID-19 vaccines within a country. And so here we have, so three of these principles that Rabbi Dorf mentioned in terms of priorities: maximizing benefits and minimizing harm, mitigating health inequities, and promoting transparency. Just going to jump a little bit. So here are some of the ethical and procedural principles that were put forth, right? Maximum benefits, equal concern, mitigation of health inequities. Then you have the, procedural such as fairness, transparency, and evidence-based. Here we see some overlap with our Jewish moral principles cited above. The committee also developed 4 risk-based criteria to apply among population groups: risk of acquiring infection, risk of severe morbidity and mortality, risk of negative societal impact, and risk of transmitting infection to others. I feel like the principle that was followed more than anything else was the one about risk of acquiring infection, the first one. In other words, if you are in certain settings that would make it far more likely to get it. I feel like those people were able to get vaccines earlier. These risks at the bottom of this page here, these risks not only reiterate the obligation to be vaccinated with one's doctor's permission, but they also help inform who should get first. This is articulated clearly in the allocation phase that the framework develops. It's important to note that in keeping with the primary principle of treating people equally, within each phase, all groups have equal priority. Additionally, equity is a cross-cutting consideration. In other words, in each population group, vaccine access should be prioritized for geographic areas identified through CDC's Social Vulnerability Index or another more specific index. This attempts to preserve the principle of equality while also balancing it with health and societal needs. These risk criteria focuses our attention on the individual level of vaccine distribution. It's important to remember that these guidelines are all recommendations to states and local governments for the ethical distribution of vaccines. The actual distribution will happen locally. And following these guidelines is ultimately up to individuals in local government and hospitals, doctors' offices, and pharmacies where the vaccines will be given. It's also up to each person who will have to wait for their turn to be vaccinated. Given the severity of the pandemic and the strain it has had on all of our lives, there may be a desire, even by well-meaning individuals, to try and jump the line. That is, to use one's connections, influence, or financial means to be vaccinated sooner than determined by government guidelines. In addition to the ethical principles articulated above, there are other Jewish sources that would forbid this type of behavior. Though generally, one should take care of oneself before assisting others, this should not come at any cost, especially at the potential cost of someone else's health. The Talmud addresses this dilemma in a well-known story about two people who were walking in the desert. It says, two people were walking along a deserted path, and in the hand of one of them was a jug of water. If both of them drink, they will both die before reaching another source of water. If one drinks, he will reach an inhabited place and survive. Ben Batora explained, it is best that both drink and both die, so that one will not see the death of his friend. But then Rabbi Akiva taught, let him live by your side. Your life comes before the life of your companion. But Rabbi Akiva thinks that an individual should put her life first. Most commentaries assume that he ruled like this because the jug of water was clearly owned by one of the two individuals. If it had been a shared jug of water, then it's possible that Rabbi Akiva would have ruled differently. It's important to note that no one suggests that the person who did not bring the jug of water should take his friend's jug. That would be stealing, and perhaps, since it would lead to his friend's death, even a more severe offense. Even though the friend's life is in danger, this is not a case where he would be justified in taking the other person's jug of water. We must take care of ourselves first, but not at the potential cost of others' health and well-being. Using one's connections, influence, or financial means to move up in the vaccine line has the potential to put other people's lives in danger and is therefore forbidden by Jewish law. So, I keep thinking about this particular phrase that I feel like we've been using a lot, especially lately, which is when we go on an airplane and you do the safety instruction video, what do they always say in terms of the oxygen masks? Right? Put on your oxygen mask, your own, before assisting somebody else, right? This is saying not necessarily. Yes, we have to be able to, preserving our own life is a priority. But if you're about to put on your oxygen mask and the other person is gasping to death, your oxygen mask, their oxygen mask should have some priority. The assumption when they say put on your oxygen mask before someone else is that it takes, 10 seconds to put on your own oxygen mask, there's plenty of time to help somebody else. Then so that principle, in other words, doesn't apply to something like this. It doesn't apply to just, grab a vaccine before somebody more vulnerable than you gets it. This is not supposed to be a rat race. So here are the so again, the have other variations of Judaism adopted ruling similar to number 3, meaning 3, like it's 3 on that screen here. COVID-19 vaccines approved by government health.
Yes, number 3, you just listed there.
Yeah, I believe, you know what, I don't know them off the top of my head, but well, actually, you know what, if I earlier I made this little remark that maybe Rabbi Peltz didn't need to include opinions on or orthodox opinions on these sorts of matters, but actually, you know what, I think that that sentence actually probably applies to that of the our Orthodox brothers and sisters. I believe they said that yes, if as long as there isn't another health concern that this would contradict, then yes. I don't know of a reform movement version of this, but I would be shocked if I'd be very surprised if they didn't. Just I'd be very surprised if they didn't. So in other words, I'm not certain, but I think it's very likely. So it's so here I think is some of the main takeaways here. Right, the idea of preserving life, that's nice, but it's not. I mean, at least we already know about that, but we go beyond this, right? We say that yes, you really, the vaccines, assuming that there is a reasonable chance that they are safe. Yes, you must. And the fact that vaccine mandates are permitted for Jewish institutions. It doesn't say anything about it doesn't weigh in on the question of are vaccine mandates permitted for for businesses that are not specifically Jewish, or secular government agencies or anything like that. It doesn't weigh in on that. It just says here's what a Jewish institution, yes, they are allowed to do so. And then, of course, one must take care to make sure that they are doing so within proper secular law. Yep.
I'm surprised that the wording isn't stronger, that Jewish institutions should, by halacha, require vaccination. Earlier the Teshuva said it should be required for individuals. So why not for the institutions, which are their personnel are individuals?
Well, I think that it's a matter of I mean, this is sort of sent out for I don't know if this is a relevant answer, but I'll try. But I'm going to see if it is. There are many Jewish institutions that, let's say, there are many Jewish institutions that, let's say they are, they make certain decisions on Jewish law that, like, in other words, as long as you're in our building, you have to do X. What you do at your home is your own business, right?
Yeah, but that's because I would think that's because it's impossible for the institution to police what people do away from the institution.
Right,
But
right. It's yeah,
as a matter of
yeah.
recommending, individuals' conduct, that you can say you should do this, you should do that.
Yeah, no, I certainly see that. I see that point. Yeah. So yeah, I guess it's a fair critique of this. I mean, I don't really know why it isn't stronger than that.
I wonder if the second part of that clause is the reason that perhaps there's some civil regional law that relates to institutions where there might be a problem.
That's fair.
So unions can get in the way of things like this. You know, what if the employees are unionized, things like that. I wonder if that's why they held back and just used that term permitted.
Could be, I suppose.
Yeah, that sounds viable. Sure. Does this? Do we have the same thing with mask mandates? I don't know. Yeah, it would utilizing the logic that Rabbi Peltz is employing here. I would think that, you know, mask mandates would also be an appropriate thing for a Jewish institution to require. I would think that it would be based on what he presented and based on what we know. You know, I don't know. Was mask wearing resistance? Yeah, I guess it was. I guess it was a thing back then. You know, at that point of COVID. I'm trying to remember when. I feel like we've gone through different stages of COVID. You know, different stages of what the public perception is, what the conventional wisdom is. Somebody once pointed out that we are currently, you know, like, what stage of COVID are we in right now? We are currently in the Wordle stage of COVID, where basically everybody's inside playing Wordle. But in all seriousness, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, were people really giving? I mean, I don't feel like there were so many mask mandates at that point, but there was certainly resistance to wearing masks in the early months of COVID. I think it's just now that I think these masks, yeah, I think the mask mandates have been more recent. So maybe an update wouldn't hurt.
I mean, speaking to that, I remember reading this earlier during this pandemic, but apparently there was resistance to wearing masks in 1918 with the Spanish influenza as well in certain groups. So this just goes back as long as people have been wearing masks, and there was some understanding that masks could prevent transmissible respiratory illness. It's the condition.
It may be, although I don't know. I think there's something about our culture right now that's just making it even more.
I agree. I think it's worse now, but apparently it existed a century ago too.
Sure. Well, listen, so I listen, that's the end of the teshuva, and we've reached the end of this class. So I hope that you've gotten a sense of some of the ways that the conservative movement considers matters of halacha and thinks about how it can potentially evolve. And it's just kind of and I hope that these kinds of examinations can lead us to, maybe study other matters as a community going forward. Again, I encourage you to, if you're able, starting next week, Purim and Empowerment. Hope that you'll be able to join us for that, spread the word. And I hope everybody has a safe and restful night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yasher koach, Rabbi.
Yeah,
Safe drive
gracias.
home.
Appreciate it.